You're watching Pedestal by Ashley Sargeant Hagan. Chapter 4. So, what's her name? Whose name? Asked Edwin, turning to his friend Philip. They were jogging side by side on treadmills in Philip's home exercise room. Your mystery woman. Your secret girlfriend, the papers say you have. You keep telling me she doesn't exist, but this time, I don't know, you're different. What do you mean? How could he possibly know? You're extremely quiet and you're smiling to yourself. You never smile when you run. You hate exercise. You only do it because Dr. Hanover has to be fit. I'm smiling right now, see? Declared Edwin, showing his teeth. Philip wasn't convinced. Edwin had been friends with Philip Kingsley March since they were teenagers and had attended the same boarding school. Philip was the second son of an earl, and he had been handed a place in his father's bank after he graduated from university. So, who's the mystery woman? Continued Philip, undaunted. Edwin turned off his treadmill and threw him an irritated look as he wiped his forehead with a towel. Should I tell him? Would she mind? Philip stopped too. I'm right, aren't I? Did you meet someone in D.C.? Yes and no, Edwin replied. Philip waited. Okay, I met someone in the airport, and we talked on the plane for about 8 hours straight. It was the most stimulating conversation I've ever had. Thanks, said his friend. Not that our conversations aren't stimulating, said Edwin, but she's just... We talked about everything. Cosmology, theology, anthropology, history. I've never met a woman who had the same interests as me. Not the same opinions, though. Have you ever heard of the Cambrian explosion? Philip shook his head. Well, she was completely infuriating. And yet, completely exhilarating. What about looks? Edwin gave a slight smile. He thought of her smiling eyes and the way she had pulled her hair back from her face as she leaned against the airplane seat beside him. She's perfect. She'll do, he said aloud. Are you going to see her again? Asked Philip. I hope so, if she doesn't cancel. We're having dinner tonight. She's here doing research at the British Museum. Speaking of the museum, I've got to get a shower. I have to be the face of the bank at some speech or other. Dad's one of the museum trustees, but he always manages to get me to go to these things instead. The CEO of Kara Inchi is here, launching the new exhibit they paid for. Kara Inchi, the oil company? Yeah, from Turkey. That's odd. He was on my plane. Mr. Tastan, right? That's the one. Lots of fuss about him since the plane crash. Bodyguards and everything. Anyway, he's made some kind of arrangement with the archaeological museums in Istanbul. They're loaning us some of their treasures, lots of cuneiform tablets and stuff. There's even the world's oldest love poem. That should interest you. Wait a minute, said Edwin, remembering something. Did you say cuneiform tablets? Yeah. Want some company? Edwin asked. His friend eyed him suspiciously. You want to go to a museum gallery opening? I've always loved the museum, remarked Edwin defensively, and Adriana might be there. She mentioned something about this exhibit. Adriana, the name finally, said Philip triumphantly. Philip's wife Brenda poked her head in. Are you staying for lunch, Edwin? She asked. If so, I need to tell Cook. No, but thanks. Got to get home so I can change. He has a hot date at the museum, explained Philip. Edwin rolled his eyes. I'll meet you there. Walking through the ornate gateway to the British Museum brought back memories. It had been years since he had passed through the doors. When you grow up within miles of the place, you can visit often, and Edwin had. He knew the permanent collection well, but lately his schedule hadn't allowed for much free time, and what free time he had, he spent elsewhere. He was surprised to find that he missed it. He headed through the Egyptian exhibits until he found the arched room, which housed the Department of the Middle East. It was a huge room, built in the early 1800s with large arched doorways, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and wooden drawers filled with countless treasures from antiquity. A crowd had already gathered. Edwin searched the room for Philip and found him standing toward the back of the group. Where's your mystery woman? He asked immediately. Edwin shook his head. Don't know. I texted her an hour ago, but she never texted back. He scanned the crowd for her. It was mostly made up of historian types, professors with shocks of uncombed hair worn long like Einstein because hair appointments took away from their studies, or women wearing long flowing skirts and Birkenstocks. There were also a number of businessmen in suits and ties like Philip, sent to represent their company's support of the exhibit. No one seemed to notice Edwin. Probably not a Dr. Hanover crowd. Mr. Tastan, looking dapper in a three-piece suit, was surrounded by grinning museum directors near a podium at the front. Edwin nervously took stock of the room, searching for anyone who looked like a terrorist. What does a terrorist look like, really? He spotted the two bodyguards easily enough, standing stoically in the front row, but they were the only conspicuous people he noticed. Someone approached the microphone, tapping it and clearing his throat. "I'm Dr. Desmond Hall, one of the trustees of the British Museum. On behalf of the museum, I'd like to thank you all for coming. We are so grateful for Kara Inchi's generous gift that enabled us to make this exhibit possible. The Museum of the Ancient Orient at the Archaeological Museums in Istanbul has one of the largest collections of cuneiform tablets in the world, and we are thrilled to have some of those priceless artifacts here under this roof. Mr. Ahmet Tastan, the CEO of Kara Inchi, has come all the way from Turkey to be with us here for the opening of the exhibit. Mr. Tastan." There was enthusiastic applause as Mr. Tastan made his way to the podium. For the first time, Edwin noticed there was a television crew set up to record the speaker's words for posterity. Mr. Tastan smiled genially over the crowd, seemingly at his ease, yet Edwin could see a deep melancholy hidden in his dark eyes. The man intrigued Edwin. How difficult it must be to make public appearances after suffering such loss. He caught himself making a mental note for a future role, on the chance that he ever had to portray a man like Mr. Tastan. "My friends," began Mr. Tastan, "it is my pleasure to represent my nation of Turkey in this act of cultural exchange. Just as the cuneiform tablets represent the beginning of writing in all of human culture, Kara Inchi, along with my brothers here in the United Kingdom, wish to unite the world with mutual understanding and appreciation through history, art, and cultural endeavors like this exhibit, and with new and improved business alliances that bring nations together instead of dividing them apart. We at Kara Inchi," a sound like a large breath of air passed over Edwin's head, followed by a quick groan. Out of the corner of his eye, Edwin caught a glimpse of something dark falling to the ground behind him. It landed with a thud that echoed eerily in the quiet room. Edwin's eyes locked with the man at the podium, and in a split second he watched the melancholy politeness of Mr. Tastan's eyes change to fear. His well-manicured hands were gripping the sides of the podium. The audience waited patiently, wondering why he had stopped his speech. Edwin turned to look behind him, but a second or two passed before he recognized what it was he saw lying in the crumpled heap on the marble floor. A man. Looking up, he saw something attached to a stand like a camera tripod, but it wasn't a camera. "It's a gun," he said aloud, surprised. His voice ricocheted through the silent room. Before Edwin's mind had caught up with what his eyes had seen, people around him were screaming and throwing themselves to the ground. He whipped around. Mr. Tastan was completely engulfed by his bodyguards, who were hurriedly assisting him out of a side door. The museum directors, hunched and panicked, followed them out. "Ed, get down!" Philip yanked on his arm and pulled him to the floor. "What just happened?" Edwin asked, staring at eye level at the apparently dead man on the floor at the back of the crowd. Blood slowly oozed in a puddle under his head. Edwin turned away as he realized the man had been shot in the forehead through a dark ski mask he was wearing. "I don't know, just stay down until somebody tells us this is over," whispered Philip. His usually composed face was tense with fear. From the ground, Edwin glanced upward to the spot the man had been when he fell. There seemed to be a second level to the arched room, a kind of iron balcony like a catwalk, about 20 feet above their heads. To reach the second tier of books and drawers, Edwin assumed. Although the rest of the room was brightly lit, the upper level was in shadow. He could still see the gun on a tripod pointed toward the podium at the front of the room. This was an assassination attempt, but someone had assassinated the assassin instead. Security guards surrounded the dead man, and others began ushering people out of the room. Edwin thought he recognized Adriana slipping through an exit. He headed that direction, hoping to catch up, but the crowd was log-jammed at the doors, not letting him pass. Whoever it was had already slipped out of the room. He turned to look for another exit. "Edwin Sterling?" A young woman grabbed his arm as he realized, too late, that the television crew was still filming. His shoulders dropped as he vainly scanned the room for a way of escape. "I didn't know you would be here," continued the reporter without relinquishing his arm. She was a young woman who probably thought she had been given the rookie assignment of the year and was only thinly veiling her immense excitement as she turned again to the camera. "Tell us, Edwin, what just happened?" She thrust a microphone in his face. "Well, I'm just as in the dark as you," he began politely. "I think someone was trying to kill Mr. Tastan, and he was shot instead." He indicated the gun that was barely visible in the catwalk shadows. "Shot? But we didn't hear any shots fired." "Well, I think it had a silencer," Edwin replied. "Shocking. Really a shocking day for everyone. Where were you when it happened?" "Actually, I was almost right underneath him. I heard what sounded like a breath going over my head, and then the guy fell right behind me." The reporter gave her most exaggerated look of shock and amazement. "Do you mean you could have been killed today?" "Well, not exactly. I mean, I suppose if the guy had fallen on me, it wouldn't have been the greatest." She turned dramatically to the camera. "Edwin Sterling nearly lost his life today at the British Museum when someone tried to kill Kara Inchi CEO Ahmed Tastan." Brilliant.